Today on BRStv Investigates, does heating and circulating affect saltwater storage? Hi, I'm Randy, a host for the YouTube series BRStv Investigates, where we take popular reefing theories, methods, questions, and products and dive even further than what the manuals and packaging will tell you in order to put them to the test in real-world environments, rate them on our scale of reef fantasy to reef certainty, and share with you, the reefing community, what we find. In a previous BRStv Investigates test, we tested saltwater storage, where the mixed saltwater was stored at room temperature without circulation for upwards of 3 weeks to see if the alkalinity and calcium levels would remain the same or stable over time. So in contrast to that, because many reefers choose to both heat and circulate their mixed saltwater during storage, we thought we'd repeat the same test, but this time with a heater and power head to keep the water warm and circulated. With that in mind, today on BRStv Investigates, we aim to answer 2 questions. 1, do parameters like alkalinity and calcium shift in heated and well-circulated reservoirs? And 2, will we see any related precipitation or crust in the bins after storage? Meaning, if we mix and heat our saltwater during storage, should we expect to see any changes to the alkalinity and calcium levels in the water? And if so, will it show up as precipitate or insoluble material in the bottom of our storage bin? So why is this important to the average reefer in their tank? Well, I'd bet it's safe to say that to some degree, we all desire stable numbers for alkalinity and calcium, and if given the choice, we'd rather not have to adjust those levels in our mixing bins prior to using the salt water for regular water changes. And along with that, if there's any opportunity that I can reduce the amount of frequent cleaning I need to do on my reservoirs and save me a bit of time and effort, I'm all ears when it comes to finding ways to reduce potential buildup inside them. How are we going to get this part 2 of our saltwater storage investigation underway? Well, we plan to test our 8 most popular salts that we used in previous tests using Tropic Marin Pro and Classic, Brightwell Neo Marine, Red Sea Coral Pro and Blue Bucket, HW Reefer, and both Instant Ocean Standard Salt and Reef Crystals. Similar to the unheated and uncirculated test, we'll mix 20 gallons of each salt to the commonly targeted 35 parts per thousand or 1.026 specific gravity and take their initial batch readings for alkalinity and calcium directly after mixing, 2 hours and 4 hours later, at 24 and 48 hours, and at the 1 and 2 week storage mark. Only this time we're adding a 100-watt Phoenix HPG heater with the external temp probe set to 78 degrees and a MaxiJet 1200. Since some of the salts directly state in the instructions to mix them cold and then heat them to the desired temperature, we'll do exactly that, where we'll start mixing each salt at room temp of around 68 degrees and then slowly heat to a common target temp of 78 degrees. We'll leave the tanks loosely covered with plastic wrap and then test each one using the same type of hobby-grade test kits that many reefers also use at home. The key point to note here with using hobby-grade test kits is there should be some expectation of accuracy margin to account for in the results, which will probably be plus or minus a half a DKH point for alkalinity and about plus or minus 10 to 15 parts per million in calcium. This accuracy range is not only within the test kit's accuracy range themselves, but also adds in some room for minor human testing procedure inconsistencies and somewhat subjective test point end readings. But I do expect the results will still be clear and meaningful to the average reefer in their own home who use the same type of test kits. Before we get into the results of this test, I have to say that Ryan and I both had expectations as to what we'd find in today's testing, because in theory, the solubility of calcium carbonate actually decreases as the temperature rises, and due to that, should cause more precipitate. However, I'll admit at face value, we're definitely wrong in those expectations. Let's first take a look at what we found for calcium levels during heated and circulated storage, keeping in mind that we do have our 10 to 15 part per million margin of error for testing procedure and testing endpoint when the reagent color changed. First, I'll show you the entire group of salt mixes all together, where you can clearly see that in almost every case there is a steady line of stable levels for each salt with no drastic drops over 2 weeks, but actually what seems to be like slight increases in levels for a majority of them. I do want to put in a reminder here, the average temperature during the test, which started at around 68 degrees, which is about room temp, After 2 hours, the average tank temp reached 72 degrees, and at 4 hours, we ended up at 76 degrees, which is a couple degrees lower than our target 78. And then somewhere between the 4-hour mark and when I took the sample at 24 hours, the tank temp stabilized at 78 and stayed that way for the rest of the test. Okay, so starting with the Tropic Marin Pro, we see a start point of 390 parts per million, and then after 2 weeks ended up around 420 for the total change of 30 parts per million over the entire testing period. What we do see here, which is also somewhat echoed in other salts, is that it takes somewhere between 4 and a full 24 hours of mixing for the levels in the Tropic Marin Pro to stabilize around that 420 mark, which we also saw visually in a previous test for clarity and contrast with a 24-hour time lapse of mixing time where the Tropic Marin Pro ended up mixing clear the fastest at around a full 8 hours. The levels we see here and what we'll also see throughout today's results lead me to believe that the salts may not be fully homogenized until sometime between 6 to 24 hours, adding to the results of our previous testing. With that in mind, we'll focus on the 24-hour to 2-week data for the remainder of the test results with the Tropic Marin Classic next, which only shows a 10-point change from 400 to 410. Brightwell Neomarine shows 380 to 400 parts per million calcium for a 20-point change. HW Reefer really had no change from 430 to 430 in our testing window. Red Sea Blue Bucket gains 10 parts per million from 420 to 430. The Red Sea Coral Pro looks very stable from 450 to 460 parts per million for a gain within the margin of error of 10 parts per million. Instant Ocean Standard also gains 10 parts per million from 415 to 425. And finally, Instant Ocean Reef Crystals shows steady results from 490 to 500 in the final parts of the test. So again, really what we're seeing here is that none of the salts dropped as we saw some do in our first storage test. And in my opinion, more importantly, none of the tanks show signs of precipitate nearly to the degree that we had in the end of our previous test, if any at all. The most dramatic results show with the elevated salts like Red Sea Coral Pro, where the side-by-side test results we can see a major difference in the levels over weeks of storage. It is notable that the mixing procedure for Coral Pro explicitly states to mix, then heat, as we have done, yet for this test we went well beyond the maximum 4 hours of mixing that they advise. Okay, let's look at alkalinity next, comparing the 24 to 2-week window like we did in the calcium results, and as a whole, each salt looks to be very stable across the board. Tropic Marin Pro was stable within 1/10 of a DKH point at 7.1 to 7.2 at any given point throughout the testing, which is well below our 0.5 DKH margin of error. Tropic Marin Classic also shows absolute stability from 9.5 to 9.5 in the latter parts of the test. Next is Brightwell Neomarine with a 7.8 start and a 7.8 DKH finish with no change. The HW Reefer Mix gains slightly from 9.0 DKH to 9.3 and still under our margin of error. The Red Sea Blue Bucket is very stable from 8.0 to 8.1 DKH, and Red Sea Coral Pro has a slight increase from 12.1 to 12.4 between 24 hours and 2 weeks. Wrapping up the alkalinity results is the Instant Ocean Standard Salt, which has an equal 10.3 and 10.3 for both the 24 hours to 2 weeks, while the Reef Crystal shows nearly a straight line from 10.8 to 10.8 DKH to round out the testing. Again, there's absolutely no denying the stability we see here with each of the salt mixes, where again, the elevated salt mixes have pretty dramatically different results than previous tests. Along with that, we're just not seeing the same signs of calcium carbonate precipitation, which at face value kind of defies what we felt should be happening and really starts to raise even more questions about the larger picture of what's happening here. So to answer today's BRStv Investigates question of do the alkalinity and calcium parameters shift in heated and well-circulated storage, I'll go ahead and give this one a 1 on the Reef Fantasy scale because we can clearly see on pretty much all fronts that the levels for both alkalinity and calcium remain very stable and almost unchanged at all, except for some slight increase in calcium as the salt is fully dissolved, but at the same time could also be a product of using hobby-grade test kits. As for the second question of whether or not there's leftover precipitate in the storage bin after heating and circulating, we definitely don't see precipitate to the degree that we did in the first BRStv Investigates test, if any at all, which does begin to raise even more questions about why and how that may be and what we're actually seeing here. Okay, how will the results of today's testing affect reefers and their tanks? Well, depending on the salt mix you use, it may be worthwhile to heat and circulate your salt water during storage, especially for those salts that purposefully have elevated levels and clearly state in the instructions how to mix them properly. That said, as we saw in previous tests, there are some salt options that show steady parameters and don't require heating and circulating, which also may have some added savings on electricity consumption of maybe $4 to $8 per month, depending on the equipment you use and the size of your mixing bins you have for your own setup. So with the results of both salt storage tests in the books, rather than simply just having answers to our questions, we've actually developed more questions that we feel could use some additional testing. In this case, we walked away with a very distinct question that we plan to test even further to continue to add clarity to the salt mixing and saltwater storage. The biggest question we want to answer here is, was the precipitation we saw in our initial saltwater storage test due to it being unheated and uncirculated, or was it just that the salts weren't mixed long enough? Based on most reefers generally feeling that mixing for an hour is adequate, in that first experiment, we followed the same thought and mixed each batch for a single hour before pulling the pump and letting them settle. It was only after testing how long it takes for each of the salts to mix clear did we realize that a majority of them take upwards of 24 hours or perhaps longer, with some standouts that mix fully clear before the 24-hour mark. So we plan to add clarity to this question by conducting 2 more tests. For today's test of heating and storing, we'll pull the plug on the heaters and pumps and let the tanks sit for a couple more weeks to see if they begin to show signs of shifting parameters or precipitate in the storage bin. Secondly, we plan to repeat the initial salt storage test, only this time we'll let each of the salts mix for a full 48 hours before turning the pumps off, and then start testing the alkalinity and calcium levels without circulation or heat to see if we get similar results. Thanks for watching this BRStv Investigates. If you'd like to see the first test we did on salt storage, click the video link at the top, or if you want to know how much your salt mix costs you to use per month, click the video in the bottom. And to sign up as a preferred reefer for your chance of getting your recent order or shopping cart refunded, hit that link in the lower left, and we'll see you on the next BRStv Investigates.